Welcome back to LA Politics in Action. We're sitting here today on October 22nd in the Occidental Political Science Department at 2:42 p.m., 2 weeks until Election Day. We are a group of students attending Occidental College here to help you navigate some key measures on the ballot this November. Today we're unpacking two key measures on this November ballot. HH and DD. Measure DD essentially tackles the way LA draws its district lines, and Measure HH aims to shake up LA's governance rules, from financial disclosures to giving more power to the city attorney. We've got a lot to dive into.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and I'll introduce ourselves here. I'll start with myself. My name is Chase, and I'll be providing context for Measure DD.
I'm Jake, and I'll be giving the pros and cons for Measure DD.
I'm Thea, and I'll be giving the context for Measure HH.
And I'm Caroline, and I'll be delving into the pros and cons of Measure HH.
And later on, you will hear an interview with Professor Issac Hale, who will give us some historical context and share insights onto how these measures could reshape LA politics into the future. All right, moving on, we're going to start with Measure DD context. So why don't you go ahead and get us started, Caroline?
All right. So, Chase, could you briefly explain why Measure DD is on the ballot right now?
Yeah, for sure. I think to understand Measure DD, we really need to look at it in light of recent scandals involving the LA City Council. In the last 5 years, we've had two significant scandals that have really shaken public trust within City Council. First, there was the Huizar scandal of 2020. He was obviously implicated in a major corruption case related to real estate deals.
And what impact does Huizar scandal have on the public perception of the city council?
Well, the Huizar scandal severely damaged the council's reputation. It highlighted issues of corruption and favoritism, leading for many LA residents to feel that their representatives were more focused on, personal gain rather than serving the public. This definitely eroded trust and sparked calls for accountability and transparency.
And what about the leaked audio of Nuri Martinez? What were the main issues there?
Well, yeah, I mean, the leaked audio featured Nuri Martinez and other council members making disparaging comments about various communities and, discussing how to manipulate redistricting for political advantage. This was very troubling because it showed a very blatant disregard for the interests of constituents in favor of political maneuvering.
So, how does Measure DD aim to address these very valid concerns?
So most notably, Measure DD aims to create an independent redistricting commission. The goal is to take the power of drawing district lines away from the city council members themselves, who might be inclined to shape district to protect their own interests. Currently, council members have the authority to draw their own district lines, leading to conflicts and public distrust, as has kind of been mentioned. So, in essence, Measure DD's response to the outcry for reform sparked by the Huizar and Martinez scandals, particularly highlighting how those comments from Martinez and her colleagues reflect the need for change in the redistricting process. All right, and we're going to move on to some pros and cons here for Measure DD. So, Jake, what do you feel is the primary reason to support Measure DD?
The largest reason to support Measure DD is that, in theory, it makes it much harder for council members to rig districts and gerrymander. Instead of having the districts drawn by the council members or elected by the residents within the districts, the measure involves a separate committee without ties or incentives to manipulate the vote, which should significantly reduce the chances of corruption and gerrymandering.
Just to clarify, will Measure DD require a larger budget or an increase in taxes for residents?
No, because Measure DD doesn't propose an entirely new redistricting system, which is another reason to support the measure, because it's a largely uncostly change that just modifies how an already existing system is done.
What are some criticisms of Measure DD?
Critics argue that the commission itself might not be immune to corruption, despite not having personal ties to the districts. There's a concern that the people that make up the new committee could be lobbied or influenced by special interests, potentially acting as a middleman for those seeking power through redistricting. Additionally, there's a risk that the individuals chosen for the commission might not fully understand LA's unique neighborhood dynamics, unlike the elected officials who represent those districts. Some believe that these officials are better equipped to draw the districts, as they may have better insight into what their communities need and how to best serve their residents.
Thank you, Jake. Great insight there into Measure DD. All right, moving on now to Measure HH context. Taya, why don't you go ahead and take us away?
So, Measure HH is essentially about rebalancing power in city government and improving transparency and accountability through a range of reforms. After the 2022 leaked audio scandal involving LA City Council members, the public wanted accountability.
Yeah, and in what ways, Taya, does Measure HH respond to that?
Well, one way is by granting the city attorney authority to issue subpoenas for local law investigations, extending powers that were previously limited to the city council. Nominees for city commissions would have to file ethics forms before being confirmed by the city council, which would ensure more scrutiny and transparency regarding conflicts of interest. This measure also responds through the Harbor Commission, which is a big subject that has led to frustration among communities impacted by city decisions without a direct say. Residents of San Pedro and Wilmington have complained about the environmental impacts of port operations with little response in city policies. Measure HH makes sure that 2 of the mayor's appointees to the Harbor Commission must be residents of neighborhoods impacted by port activities, finally giving them a say.
No, that sounds like a huge initiative, for expanding local voices, kind of in that San Pedro area. Is there anything else to this measure?
Yeah, so the amendment strengthens the city controller's ability to audit city departments, contractors, and subcontractors using city funds, which would overall increase oversight and accountability.
I see. So you could really think of Measure HH as sort of a cleanup of the current city charter.
Exactly. It is addressing the issues that have been debated for years while setting up for broader reforms that may come in the future, like expanding the size of the city council.
All right, perfect. We're gonna go ahead and move on to some pros and cons here for Measure HH. So, Caroline, I know Measure HH really aims for more transparency, but could you break down in kind of exactly how it would work and maybe some key changes that people are talking about?
Sure thing, Chase. Supporters of Measure HH see it as a way to hold the city's leadership to higher standards of accountability. One of the main changes would be requiring financial disclosures from commission appointees before they can even be confirmed, making it harder to hide conflicts of interest, so there's this added layer of oversight right at the start.
Right, so it's like a preventative measure. And then there's the city attorney's expanded powers too, right?
Precisely. Currently, the city attorney doesn't have subpoena power for city matters. That authority sits with the controller, the council, and some other offices. Measure HH would change that by expanding the city attorney's subpoena power, giving them more tools to investigate potential misconduct within city operations. Essentially, it could make it much easier to catch things before they become major issues.
It sounds like this measure could create a more robust system of checks and balances, but I'm guessing it's not all positive. What are some critics saying about the changes?
Well, opponents are really worried about the bureaucratic impact this has. With new oversight mechanisms, there's always a risk of slowing down city processes. This could very much end up delaying projects or decisions, which isn't very ideal in a city as large and complex as LA. Adding new oversight processes could also mean that the city needs more staff or resources to enforce these regulations properly. And that's expensive, especially when you consider that LA has been facing budget cuts in several different departments.
True. So, would you say, Caroline, that there's maybe a potential risk of overreach with this expanded subpoena power? I can imagine some people would be worried about giving, the city attorney, such a high level of authority.
Yeah, definitely. Some people feel that expanding the city's attorney power could disrupt the balance of power among city officials. So while it could lead to better oversight, there's always that risk that it might create new conflicts within city government.
So this measure could fundamentally change the dynamics within LA city government. On one hand, there's a push for accountability, but on the other, you have the practical challenges of implementation and potential unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's a trade off. Voters will need to decide if the benefits of increased transparency and accountability are worth the potential downsides.
And of course, the impacts wouldn't be immediate. There would likely be an adjustment period while the city figures out how to make these changes work in practice.
Right. And that adjustment period could reveal whether Measure HH will actually make a difference. How these changes are implemented could make or break the measure's effectiveness.
Definitely. So ultimately, the question is whether residents believe these reforms will make the city government more accountable, or if they worry it might just bog down an already complex system even further.
Mm-hmm. With LA's history of political scandals, there's a lot of pressure for change. But like you said, Thea, it's about balancing that desire for accountability with the realities of running a big city. We'll just have to see if Measure HH is the right way to strike that balance.
All right. Yeah. So I think taken from all that, it seems Measure HH really seems to be all about transparency, but also it comes with some potentially big trade-offs in both efficiency and cost. Thank you for breaking that down, Caroline. It's definitely a lot for voters to think about for both of these measures, in such a crucial election here coming up in a couple weeks. All right, welcome back, everybody. And for this segment of the show, we are beyond excited to welcome Professor of Occidental College, Issac Hale, to the podcast. Professor Hale is an Oxy alum. He is part of the class of 2011, where he earned his degree in politics. Prior to accepting a job at his alma mater in 2022, Professor Hale was an associate at Tolchin Research. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Davis, and also was an equity research scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara. How are you doing today, Professor Hale?
I'm doing great.
Awesome, that's great. So we wanted to jump in and talk to you about amendments HH and DD with some charter reform stuff, and obviously with a very critical and important election coming up here, we are hoping to inform voters better, and we feel that your platform would be very helpful in doing so. A little bit. So how do you feel about how these measures fit into the more broader debate about political accountability and ethics at the local level?
Yeah, so I think this has been a long-standing conflict in Los Angeles politics. So we obviously saw the huge scandal that erupted over redistricting in Los Angeles City Council after the explosive tapes involving Nuri Martinez, the LA Labor Fed. So obviously redistricting and racial redistricting is very front and center in terms of ethics in the city of Los Angeles. And there was an academic panel, an expert panel that was put together to provide recommendations for charter reform here in the city of Los Angeles. They presented a variety of suggestions, including independent redistricting, ethics reform, and expanding the size of the city council. We're seeing in Amendment DD that independent redistricting measure is going to be occurring. In Amendment HH, that some of those ethics suggestions are going to be occurring. Unfortunately, it appears that expansion of the council is off the table for now, which is a real shame because I think that's probably the most important reform that was proposed.
Most definitely. And we have a further question for you. And this just kind of ties things together more so. So how do you feel, with the inclusion of HH and DD on the ballot, what do you feel that these measures say about the movement that has been kind of going on for greater accountability from our elected officials, especially in context of the recent charges that have been brought against New York City Mayor Eric Adams?
That's a great question. I think there is a desire to hold members of the government accountable for their misdeeds. And in fact, the LA City Council has seen many of its current and former members face indictments for accusations of criminal or civil misconduct in recent years. So that's certainly something that we in LA are no stranger to in our politics. At the same time, I think it also shows the ability of entrenched systems to resist change. Yes, we are seeing an independent redistricting committee being put forth on the ballot. I think it's very likely that both measures DD and HH, which would add some ethics reforms to LA, I think it's very likely that both of these will pass. But it's also the case that due to the machinations, the legislative maneuvers of members of the city council, we will not be seeing council expansion on the ballot. And again, I think this is quite possibly the most important reform that could have happened. This is a reform that could have dramatically changed the functioning of the city council. It could have changed what the city council looks like, the city council's demographics, the kind of interests that are represented on the council. And these reforms, while they may be a marginal increase for good governance, while I think they are a good idea, they're not going to transform the governance of the city of LA.
Very cool. All right. Well, I believe that is all we had to cover. We would like to thank Professor Hale very much for taking time out of his day to conduct this interview and provide some very important insight into this upcoming election and things that voters should know. All right, coming back here very quickly. Some great insight from Professor Hale there. I think he expands upon our accountability movement discussion very well, especially in context of both of these measures. His point about council expansion is very important as well. I think it's good food for thought for voters, not only for this election, but for future elections, about how this accountability movement could potentially lead to a call to expand city council sometime in the future. To hear the full interview, that can be found at youtube.com/@chasemp5231. All right, that's going to do it for the show today. Special thanks again to Professor Hale. That was a great interview. It was great to have him on. From Caroline Bay-Tarzary, Thea Chamberlain, Jake Katz, I'm Chase Miller. This has been LA Politics in Action. Happy voting.